Hello everyone, I'm Brut Code. I'm a 14-year-old developer. Welcome to Brut Code, and in this channel you learn Web3 coding from a 14-year-old guy. Hello everyone, in today's video we are going to learn about constructors, modifiers and functions in Solidity. So without wasting much of our time, let's get straight to it. For this tutorial, we would be using Remix Online IDE. If you haven't watched my video on tools, please take a look at it. Now we will create a new file in the contracts directory, which we just call my contract, and then we will define the license for our file. So if you are using version higher than version lower than 0.6, you need not define SPDX license identifier, but above 0.6 versions of Solidity, you need to define the SPDX license identifier. And now we will just define the version of Solidity to be 0.8.8, so it's a pragma Solidity 0.8.8, and then we will define the contract as contract and my contract. So just name this contract as my contract, and this contract would take in a public variable. If you haven't watched my video on variable, please get watch it. So it would be a number, uint 256 number, and then we would first look at constructors. So constructors are something like one-time functions which run during the deployment of the contract. So to define a constructor, you should just use the keyword as constructor and give it the function sign, parentheses, and this is basically a constructor. So in my constructor, I would pass a value. So it would take one parameter called underscore num, so a uint underscore num, and we would just set the value of our variable to the value of the input. If I just compile this and if I deploy it, you see here we have one parameter. So to define num, we could add here any value, like I would say 107. If I hit deploy, you could view the value of num over here. So the value of num is 107. If I say the value of num is 101 and deploy it, then you could again see the value of num to be 101. So after once you have changed this, you cannot change it again, and the value remains constant. But you could define functions which can change the value of the variable. Like suppose we would say function, and this function would change value. So always remember, you should define the functions in camel format, which is the first words first letter should be small, and the second words and the rest of the words first letters should be in capital. This is called as camel format. If you would be coming from other programming languages, you should remember this, and just give again we would give another input value as num. So this is just an input value, it does not get stored anywhere, so we could reuse it easily over here. The function change value is public, and then would set the value of num to num. So this function does the same work as this constructor. So if I just compile the contract, and if I just deploy it with a number, let's say 88, and deploy, and now we have two things over here. One is the value of num, you could call it. Always remember the button color, the yellow orange button color is the transact function, and the blue button is always the call function. That means if you run the blue button function, it wouldn't cost you any gas, whereas if you run the orange button function, it would cost you some gas. So now let's do the num as, let's say 67, and if I transact, here you see my transaction is successful, and if I hit num, it is 67. We have successfully updated the value of num here. So now we would move on to modifiers. Modifiers are widely used by developers all over the globe. The main purpose of modifiers is to reduce the code. So if you suppose you have function add is a public function, and we'll just leave it blank for now, and then function subtract. So function subtract, and this function is also public, and let's leave it blank. So if I want to input the same amount same code over here, so let's say require, so we require that the num is not is equal to 0, and if it is equal to 0, we would say number is 0. So yes, and let's see what's that. So we can just specify a view, and same over here. So now we say this requires, so I'll just copy this line. Oh yeah, so these both functions first check the value of num is equal to 0, and if it is 0 we would add code. So here you can add add your own code, and here also would say add your own code. So these both functions first check the value of num is equal to 0, and they then they follow out with the code. So these are just two functions, but if you have multiple functions that call this require statement, you would need to put that in a modifier. So instead of adding these lines in the functions, you could just copy it and would say modifier, and would just name it like, let's say, 0 value, and this would be, let me see, and yeah. So basically now we would set the require function over here, and at the end we would just specify an underscore and a semicolon. So this underscore specifies that after you have run the require statement, you run the rest of the code. So if you want to check the value of 0 at the end of the code, you would run these underscore function at the start. But now I wouldn't want to set it over here, I would just put it down here. So now instead of adding this require statements by our own, we would just add here the 0 value parameter, and the same is here. So we'll say 0 value, and this is basically it. So if I now just compile the contract, and if I deploy it with the number, let's say 300, and we are here. So now we have two functions. This is a view function, and we could view the num. So if I call the add function, you see here the transaction has been reverted to the initial state. Number is 0. So we need to set the number to 0. So if I just hit this also, you could see again the number is 0 function, 0 message we have got. So if we put here the value of num to 0, yeah, it is successful. And if we now call add, it is successful. Track is successful. And if we change it to any other number like 20, and now if we call, it is reverted, is also reverted. So these are modifiers. Modifiers are very helpful for, let's say, like ownership. So if you want to define the ownership of a contract, you would need this. So I would just show you example of owner contract. So this is basically an example of owner contract. So this contract, what it does is that it sets the owner to message.sender. So what this will do is the first person who sends the who deploys the contract is the owner of the contract, So this defines the constructor. So constructor are also used to define owners, mainly in the ERC20 contracts. The modifiers, only owner, are used in functions, and they use the same require function like message.sender is owner. Otherwise, they return with not owner function. So that was all for our modifiers, functions, and the constructors. So now consider subscribing my YouTube channel, and also follow me on Twitter if you haven't yet. So that was all for today. Thanks for watching, and be sure to hit the bell icon to get my more notifications from me